Hello and welcome to the Explicit Direct Instruction Podcast, where resources don't teach students, teachers teach students. I always like to say something like that. John, you just got back from New York. You were doing an English language workshop, is that right? ELD, ENL?
That was the big focus. We talked about student engagement and some of our strategies, the pronunciation, even the one we're doing today, complete sentences, really work for ELs.
When I hear complete sentences, I kind of feel like everyone's kind of doing it. And I feel like my kids are already giving me complete sentences. I think my students are already giving me complete sentences. What do you mean by complete sentences? When do we do it?
Well, actually, we want students to answer every question in a complete sentence, but we don't want them to say, my answer is 15. We want them to say, the perimeter of the polygon is 15. We want them to be using the academic language. So the real high point of what we're talking about today is the students using the academic language from the lesson. They're practicing it, they're using it, they're saying it, they're hearing it. They're learning new vocabulary, using it, and they're practicing having it in sentences. And Joel, you probably heard academic discussions as opposed to, we're not just doing conversation with ELs, we're trying to be doing academic focused conversation.
Right. Now you're okay. So we're having our students answer complete sentences. And I'm going to ask you again. I know you said it, but I want to make sure everyone hears this. Where does the language come from? And are you saying we're using sentence frames?
Yeah, actually, the language comes from the lesson. That's where we don't say my answer is 6. We say the character trait is blank. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple lessons. Well, I'm not going to show you. We can't see it, but I'm just going to pull a couple up here so we can kind of look at it. Okay, and let's just start. Here's a very simple one in kindergarten, and I actually taught this lesson. It was the the T sound, that T sound. So I would give I would give a word, and they had to identify with their green or white whiteboard, yes or no, do they hear the T sound? Okay. But then they had to say afterwards, I hear the T sound. And I had the word to. Students, let's listen carefully. Do you hear the T sound in the word to? Show me your whiteboards, red or green, yes or no. Okay. Now I'm going to call some of you to report out. And you should be saying, yes, I hear the T sound in to. And then let's turn to our partners. Let's practice that first so we're ready. So we use the sentence frames because I don't want this student just say, yes, I hear it.
Now, when you say sentence frames, okay, so the question is, do you hear, using your example, the question is, do you hear the T sound in to? So therefore, the sentence frame should be, I do or do not hear the T sound in to. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's it. And I think and eventually the students pick up on it, and we should actually be telling the students, the sentence frame comes from the question. If there's a question, who is the character in the passage? Your answer should be the character in the passage is blank. Okay.
Now, when we were in New York doing the presentation for the ENL students, one thing came across, and I think you were talking to a superintendent or maybe it was teacher, and you were giving an example of questions and answers and how assessments would like the part of the question as part of the answer. Can you elaborate on your thoughts on that?
Oh, yes. We've done a lot of test analysis here. And, they have what's now called a constructed response where you have to write an answer. It's not A, B, C, D, multiple choice. You have to physically write an answer. And in the test I was analyzing, you could get 0, 1, or 2 points. And the question was, why did the author use figurative language? And the question was, why did the author use figurative language in the passage? And to get 2 points, you had to say the author used figurative language in the passage to, and then you gave the rest of the answer. If you just gave
My
the answer
goodness.
to show the humor and the characters, it was something like that. It didn't work. If you just gave the answer, you had to have that whole sentence out there. So you couldn't get the 2 points.
So
Now, of
even
course,
though the student would write the correct answer without that academic, the figurative language or the example you gave, if they didn't reference that from the question itself, and then
yeah.
they get access to the full 2 points. Yeah, that sounds like John, lately I've been telling my teachers, and my students, those tricky test makers are out to get us. Now, can you give us another example of how to use sentence frames? And I have a couple more questions for you before we finish this podcast, but I want to hear 1 or 2 more examples from you, if that's okay.
Well, let me tell you the sentence frames. The best strategy is you read the question chorally with the students, or use the tract reading or the pre-read, or just high school, you can just read it together. And of course, that's because there's academic language in the sentence. You want the student to even read it. Then we practice reading the sentence frame. Now, here's a third grade example. Unit fraction, that's a one part of equal parts, like 1/3, 1/4, 1/5. So we have a drawing down here. We say, which figure below shows a unit fraction? Explain. So we're all going to read that. Then we have a sentence frame, and we just say blank for the missing word. So student, listen, here's how you're going to answer. Blank shows a unit fraction because. So I even practice that. And then when you pair share with your partner, you're using the academic 2 more times, the language 2 more times. You're hearing it and speaking. So it's good to even have the kids read the sentence frame.
That's really interesting. One of our teachers that we worked with recently, and everybody's always nice, but they felt that sentence frames were a bit, mm, uh, they were a little bit afraid to use sentence frames because they really want the students to express themselves. And they weren't being negative, they just had sort of a little bit of a different opinion. What's your thoughts on students not using a sentence frame or coming up with their own sentence frame?
Well, we're using the sentence frames because I want them to use the vocabulary. I want the listening and speaking and practicing and trying to get that vocabulary into their productive vocabulary. But what we do is we also ask to justify your answer. The character in the passage is blank because the inverse operation is the first step in solving the linear inequality is. So the justification is where you really kids thinking and explaining. And they're not just reading back a statement, filling in the blanks with the answer. They're actually justifying it. So I think we need to add that to our idea of complete sentences. They have to justify their answer and explain their thinking, how they got it, how they know it's correct.
Yeah, I'm always a big fan of the word. You just gave an example. Blank shows a unit fraction because. And I always like that word because. Why do you seem to always have the word because in all of your sentence frames, John?
Because that makes you explain your answer. And you could say the unit fraction is explain your answer. A lot of times you just have the word explain your answer. In fact, the question was that way. Which figure below shows a unit fraction? Explain. But the sentence frame is blank shows a unit fraction because. So because becomes your explanation.
So you're saying this, let me make sure I have the steps right. So you're saying the sentence frame to them, they're saying it with you, they're saying it by themselves. And then you like to do another strategy. You like to do a pair share, is that right?
Yeah, we're going to pair share. I know we've talked about it over and over in an indirectly sense in these different webinars and podcasts, but basically every question should be pair shared, every single question, because we want the kids to maximize the use of language. We want them to be thinking. We want every child to answer, not just the 3 we call, to do the checking for understanding.
In regards to complete sentences, is there a strategy on what students to call first or second or third, or how do you like to get the answers out?
Well, actually, there's 2 big ideas to think about. You cannot call the hand wavers in the front row that typically get called the whole year, because only those 3 students are really answering. And your survey is no good. You're trying to survey did all 25 students learn, and you called just 3. We need to go to randomness. And Joel, you've heard of the equity sticks or popsicle sticks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is what we have to do. We need to distribute the questions. The second way to get an accurate measure is whiteboards, because then there's no statistical sampling. You're actually looking at everyone. So really, these are the 2 ideas. How can we measure if everyone's learning? Whiteboards, everybody. If it's just a generic question without whiteboards, then we just call random students. If random students can answer, then probably the class can answer.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us on the Explicit Direct Instruction Podcast. Today, we explored the power of complete sentences, sentence frames, and academic language in student learning. Remember, structured responses help students internalize key concepts and succeed in assessments. Don't forget to implement strategies like pair sharing, picking non-volunteers, and whiteboards to maximize student engagement. Stay tuned for future episodes, where we'll continue exploring the powerful strategies of EDI.